Welcome back to the Energy Conversations podcast, where we break down the complexities of the South African energy sector into digestible insights. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and today we will be having a roundtable discussion unpacking the impact of the just energy transition on local communities. We will be discussing and unpacking the challenges as well as opportunities that are presented. My guests joining me for this conversation are Fezeka Stuurman, Brian Kamanzi, Celiwe Mabaso, Muhammed Lokhat, and Mthembi. The just energy transition presents both challenges and opportunities for local communities, and our collective efforts will be crucial in ensuring a sustainable and equitable future for all. But before we dig into today's topic, I'd like us to start with just some brief introductions, and I'd like each of our guests to please share briefly about what their current role is in the energy sector. Fezeka, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Thokozile. I'm Fezeka Stuurman, and I'm the CEO and the founder of the Cultiver Group. And we provide social facilitation services on renewable energy projects in the renewable energy sector and mines as well. Our work is premised primarily on the inclusion of excluded communities in the just energy transition.
Thank you very much. Celiwe, if you could briefly introduce yourself and your role.
Thanks, Thokozile. Celiwe Mabaso. I am a social performance practitioner within the renewable energy space. Currently the head of social performance for EDF Renewables, and my role is truly to assist with mapping out of community needs and leading the process of program design from an SED, socioeconomic development and enterprise development perspective.
Thank you very much. Fulani, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Togo. My name is Mthembi, and I'm an entrepreneur in the sector. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the Pele Group, and our work intersects power generation in the renewable energy sector as well as community development. And I guess in terms of my direct function, I'm accountable for the group's ESG strategy, which of course goes beyond what we do in a community context, but really, considers our impact on both society and the environment, as well as our impact investing work.
Thank you, Fulani. Muhammed, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Yes, Thokozile, and good afternoon to you. Thank you very much for having me on your show, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak on important topics. My name is Muhammed Lokhat. I'm currently an associate within the Energy Council of South Africa. So the Energy Council is an initiative that brings together key public and private sector companies, businesses, industry associations, and finance institutions that have a significant presence in the energy sector. Currently, I'm tasked with leading our power sector reform strategy. So thank you, Thokozile, and I'm looking forward to being here.
Thank you very much. Brian, if I can close off with you, if you could briefly just introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Kamanzi. I'm a researcher at the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and we basically support trade unions in their campaigns to keep energy systems public, to support with industrial policy development in service of the just energy transition, to do work associated with those issues. So nice to meet everyone, and I'm happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin in positioning this episode with just some opening remarks from our guests and really taking it back to what does the term just energy transition actually mean, and how do each of our guests see it impacting local communities, and particularly those that are historically disadvantaged or reliant on traditional energy sectors. Brian, I'd like to start with your opening remarks, please.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very contested for me. We support a conceptualization of the just energy transition, which basically derives from the labor movement itself, the international labor movement. So drawing from unions in North America who had this idea about a workers' super fund for workers who are transitioning out of the fossil fuel and the defense industries, moving over into green industries. We saw over 10 years ago a landmark policy document developed by COSATU's climate policy document, which had a fairly ambitious vision about what a transition beyond energy could look like. And then a year later, a resolution made by the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, or its conceptualization of socially owned renewables, thinking about how renewable energy and new forms of decentralized generation could fall under public and more social community ownership. So really, what were those things responding to? It was responding to a few things. One is out of an acknowledgement about the need to respond to the impact to the drivers of climate change, the use of fossil fuels. We need to move towards renewable energy, but an acknowledgement that many workers and communities are embedded within these industries and are at great risk to the loss of their closure, right? Whether that's closure through the end of the economic life of these devices or systems, or through a phase out by policy choice. So there's that risk on the one hand. There's also the other risk of, the communities who are not directly working at these facilities may be impacted by the economic activity footprint of these industries. There needs to be some plan for them. We need to be thinking about how to essentially reconstruct a society that is based on fossil fuels towards something different, something that is different and equitable. So, for me, in closing, there's really two flaws to the problem. There's the one that is really about social protection, protecting the workers and the communities who are directly impacted by this issue. And then the other level, which is a more society-wide transformation question, which is how do we plan for the future? How we build a different kind of society that is also resilient enough to withstand the impacts of climate change that we know are coming, whether or not a country like South Africa is able to reduce its emissions or not. So, in closing, unfortunately, that term has really been captured to mean anything and everything, and it is now included. We've drifted quite far from Labour's initial conceptualization, and now it's essentially a greenwashing of the renewable energy power producing program and other sector market reforms that essentially really undermine Labour's initial proposal. So that's my 2 cents on the matter, and again, happy to be here and happy to engage with other colleagues.
Thank you very much for that. Muhammed, if we could hear your opening remarks just in terms of what does the term just energy transition mean to you and how do you see it impacting local communities?
Thank you, Thokozile. I think it's tough to follow Brian, who's unpacked the term quite eloquently, so I'll be quite short. For me, the just transition isn't just an economic imperative, as Brian mentioned. It must also address the socioeconomic issues, the challenges, and foster economic inclusion in these communities that will be affected by the coal closures. We must also manage geographic and cultural dislocations. In South Africa, we've got a history of migrant labor, and many of the people that work in the coal stations are not originally from those areas. And we need to manage those dislocations and ensure that they are not repeated in the future. I think it's also important to talk about the practical aspects of what the just transition means. To me, that means that key guardrails must be put in place to ensure that these communities, and we use the term communities because it's not just the direct workers, aren't left behind. These communities have sacrificed a lot in the economic upliftment of our country as a whole, so that we've enjoyed cheap electricity for many years. So they need to be upskilled in terms of new job opportunities in the new economy. We need to manage these labor migrations and dislocations, and they must be included in economic participation in new ways in the new economy. So ensuring that these communities don't turn into ghost towns and that these communities have a future is of paramount importance to me. And I want to end off on this, Thokozile. We need to ensure that the just transition and the just energy transition and the monies that are being allocated to it are not a panacea to all our problems in South Africa. It's not going to solve all our social ills. It's not going to solve all our economic ills. And we can't look at it that way. And we can't, importantly, give communities the indication or the expectation that it might. The just transition and our efforts in that area can only do so much. The rest requires reinvigorated government, a local government that delivers services for its people, and an invigorated business environment. I'll end off with that. Thank you, Thokozile.
Thank you for that, Muhammed. Fezeka, if we could hear some opening remarks from your side in terms of the just energy transition and impact on local communities.
Thanks, Togo. I think for me and where we sit, primarily sort of at the coalface in communities, for us the term Justness in a South African context implies, I think, redress and the pursuit of equity across the board. So, and I think to look more broadly, I think we've been focusing quite a bit on communities in the just energy transition that are impacted by carbon intensive ways of producing electricity. But I think we may be losing sight of other communities outside of these geographic locations. And so for me, and in my view, I think the litmus test for justness really rests on our ability as a nation to ensure that as we transition, we take communities along, and not as a tick box exercise, but really innovatively looking at ways in which we can ensure that we're not further entrenching the inequalities of the past, but rather including communities broadly in this discourse and in the transition. And ultimately to say, for me, it would be that question, asking that question to community members, and for them being able to answer the question in a manner that clearly articulates what the win is for communities. And so again, I think in closing, and maybe to add on to what my colleagues have said, if we're talking justness in an African or South African context, it's people-centered, it's people-centric. And as we transition, it really is to ensure that we don't further repeat what we've done in the past, but we really look innovatively at ways to include the people that we have, as opposed to the people that we hope and wish that we had. So yeah, that's my take.
Thank you very much for that, Fezeka. Celiwe, I'd like to ask you to share your opening remarks.
Thanks, Togo. I guess I'll just build on to what Fezeka has shared. Truly, in my view, a just energy transition is intentional. Not only is it intentional, but it does look beyond technology, I guess, in that sense. I think we've got there is quite a great misconception on the linkages between renewables and coal and how those will directly impact each other, but rather let's look beyond that and see what opportunities can we create through a transition, right? So how do we look beyond the tech and the STEM jobs? How do we look at opportunities in social employment to drive inclusion at various levels of those communities and beyond those communities as well?
Thank you very much for that, Celiwe. Fulani, if I could ask you to close off the round of opening remarks.
Sure, thanks, Togo. And really mine is to just agree, I think, with all the colleagues. I mean, there's, on the one hand, you can think about the just energy transition in terms of its definitional integrity. And, Brian indicated that it does stem from a movement in the United States that was concerned with securing workers in a particular sector. If you fast forward to where we are in South Africa today, I think the conversation is a lot broader because it is about the continuation of the justice project in South Africa in general. And, energy is just one sectoral intersect in that story, but it's fundamentally about, how it is you ensure that those who are historically excluded from economic participation are able to participate and benefit from the entirety of what is the socioeconomy. So, the energy component is just one piece. And if we take an even broader perspective on history, it's true by definition that there'll always be transitions in sectors. Technologies are always evolving, and there's always a requirement to think about those who are currently in the sectors that represent the mainstream, and then also those who could be included as a consequence of new innovations, technology innovations. So I think the requirement is one of embracing the fact that there is change, and change ought not sort of intimidate us, but we need to negotiate that change in a way that ensures that there continues to be participation. Our problem in South Africa is not just about saving the jobs that we have, it's about expanding that pool dramatically. And in particular, when you look at the energy sector, it's also about the opportunity to diversify the geography of energy in our country and what that means for communities who've been forgotten and or have existed on the periphery of this economy for a very long time. So, when I hear just energy transition, I think of an economic opportunity. It's an opportunity to rethink what's been happening in places that currently dominate the sector, and an opportunity to invest for the first time in communities that haven't had any investment. And so it's the story of justice as it pertains to our country, and energy is just one intersect. I think Celiwe spoke already about the various technologies to consider as the economy evolves. And so it really ought to be about what it means to include South Africans, the majority of whom have been historically excluded, in the economy that is today and will be tomorrow.
Thank you for that, Fulani. Brian, we often hear, or Komati is often been cited as an example, when there's been conversations or discussions around a just energy transition. And you've written extensively on the impact of the Komati closure on local communities. Can you explain how the closure of Komati impacted the local community and just give us a bit more insights around that?
Sure. I think the best way for me to do that is just to give it a little bit of some context about what I experienced. So in the year prior to Komati's closure, I was working with the Institute for Economic Justice in a similar role as I'm working now. And I had been invited by shop stewards from the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, with the majority union at the site. And essentially they wanted to understand the energy transition debates a little bit better, but B, they were concerned about how they were being excluded from the conversations about what is to happen on site. And there was a lot of anxiety among workers. So as I went throughout the year, anxiety grew, and at no stage in the process, I think there were on site over 600 workers actively on the site by the time we had left. I had maybe met 10 to 15% of those, so it's no large amount. There was concern about being seen at meetings, about being observed. I think by the end, a lot of that had dissipated, but there were concerns around the fact that there were posters around the site saying just energy transition, climate change, and so on. Workers weren't quite sure what was going on. There were two big categories of workers on site. Those who were permanently employed by Eskom and those who were subcontracted. Some of those who were subcontracted were performing roles like gardening, catering, but it also goes all the way up to technical maintenance contracts, right? Now, Eskom throughout the process had insisted and insists to this day that no Eskom employee would be let go in the process of closing Komati. Of course, what that elides is that half of the complement of workers at that time were not actually Eskom employees. So obviously, we had some Eskom employees in our meetings throughout that year, but most of the people who had attended our reflection sessions were contract workers, right? And quite a number of them service staff were completely left in the lurch, were very depressed about the closure and didn't understand what was going on. I mean, you heard statements like, they are still burning coal in Germany. Why do we have to close this now? We're in the midst of load shedding, all these things. So, of course, there are many responses that one can give, but you really got the sense of anxiety, depression, fostered by this not being included in the process. While you're seeing on the news, I think the World Bank, one of our meetings happened not long after one of the directors at the World Bank had visited, and an executive, if not the president, I think Alok Sharma, I forget his position, from a COP proceedings, went to Komati and said, this is a fantastic example of how things are going to be done. Eskom had developed fairly illustrious plans of how to repurpose the site and repower the site using renewable energy, some cleaning of the environment, alien vegetation, building batteries on site. But there were no clear senses about how existing workers were going to be integrated and how community members were going to be engaged about what was going to be developed. A report was put out by Groundwork. I think it's Contested Transitions. If you Google that online, you'll find Groundwork and then Contested Transitions. You'll find the rest of the title. And it illustrates how the public consultation process really was not thorough. Community members didn't properly understand the gravity of what was happening. And also it was really unclear about how opportunities that were going to emerge were going to be made available. The last thing I'll say on it, and to open up further discussion, because I know that there are some people in this facility in this meeting who work with independent power producers. In the tender meeting, we asked two questions. We attended the tender meeting for some of the new renewable energy projects on site. We asked a simple question: do companies who are bidding for projects on site need to consider workers and community members on site and how to specifically integrate them into the construction of the facility? The answer was no. Nobody had a problem with that. And I know I've worked in IPP before, so I know that there's some division of labor. The people who are working in community development might not be the same group of people bidding or developing the commercial strategy, but nobody said anything. To me, this question around the just energy transition, there's an element of lip service and an element of feel-goodism, I suppose, about it, that doesn't necessarily relate to when money is being spent and when international funds are being elicited and plans are being developed, who's really at the table, who's being excluded. Just transition should mean collective bargaining agreements. It should mean clarity for the people who are directly impacted about how they can negotiate, the fact that an acknowledgement that they are actually negotiators at the table, that things aren't simply happening to them. Because all the opportunities we're talking about, we're saying like the just transition is more than just protecting people's current jobs. We're not even doing that. So you're absolutely right. It's more than that, but we're not even doing that.
Thank you for that, Brian. Muhammed, you've also done some work in local or in mining communities, and you've contributed to a paper discussing the varieties of the just transition and really looking to assess and conducted in-depth interviews with the number of coal miners to assess the public support for the just energy transition. Would you be able to share what were some of the key findings from the work or the research that you were able to undertake in terms of how mining communities perceive the just energy transition?
Yes, absolutely, Thokozile. And before I answer, I must just say that all credit for this piece of work that I undertook is due to my supervisor at the time, Dr. Mthembi Lokhat, who really was the driving force behind a lot of the research done in that area. So Dr. Lokhat and I, we spent about a few days in Kwagga, in close to Witbank in Mpumalanga, which is quite close to quite a few power stations, Duva being one of them. During that period, we interviewed about 50 coal mine workers, both current as well as retired or let go workers. So many of these coal workers were from the area, but many of those settled down from other areas and just made Group their place of living after their contracts were over. We did this in conjunction with a small group called the Fulani Environmental Movement that's based there, headed by Promise Mabilo. So the situation in Kwagga is quite dire, to be honest with you. There's no tarred roads, there's no electricity, there's no sewage. There's really a lack of opportunities, right, apart from coal mining. And that's what was reflected during our interview process. I'll never forget walking down next to a stream of sewage, and we were just wondering what's going on here. And a mother with her baby slung behind her back and another toddler just walking, just hopped across the sewage and went to their house. So there's open mines, there's illegal mining going on where the blasting really affects houses and people complain about their windows being shattered and loud noises and so on. But anyway, that's just the context of the place. So the questions we asked the miners, the 50 of them, were around their jobs and their lives in this area, as well as what they'd like to do alternatively. So we asked them, do you like working in a coal mine? What's the health effects? So almost all of them complained about asthma. Some had falls at work, occupational issues. The women complained about miscarriages as a result of being underground. A lot of the miners complained about eyesight issues, and all couched within the fact that while they are on contract or working at the mine, they get a full bill of health. As soon as they leave, these issues start coming about when they go to a different doctor or state doctor, so on. That was something that we really flagged on. We then asked them, are you aware of climate change? Yes, we are. We hear it on the radio. We hear it from Fulani Environmental Movement. They have weekly meetings and so on. Is it fair if you lost your jobs because of climate change? No. How will we pay for our school fees? How will we finish our homes? How will we do X, Y, Z? Then we asked them, okay, do you like working in a coal mine? What else would you like to do? Almost all of them said didn't like it. You know, we'd rather open up a chicken coop or open up a small spaza shop or whatever else it may be. Then we ended off with, would you like your child to work in a coal mine? And out of all of them, I think all of them said absolutely not. It wasn't just like a no, it was an absolutely not. Why do you continue doing it? Because we have to. We have so much bills and stuff to pay. So ultimately, my understanding of the just transition is that people are hungry for alternate economic opportunities, right? They're stuck in the cycle where they have to work in these places that negatively affect them in order to put food on the table. So just to give that context and color to this discussion. Thank you, Thokozile.
Thank you very much for that. This is something that Brian touched on a bit earlier, just talking around IPPs and around renewable energy projects. Fezeka, I wanted to come to you and just ask, how do renewable energy projects fit into the just energy transition, and what are some of the pros and cons?
Thanks, Togo. I think for us, the renewable energy projects are critical in the just energy transition discussion. I think the entire transition is centered around these projects. The just energy transition is centered around these projects. I think the projects present an amazing opportunity. Humani touched on it a bit earlier around some of these projects being in environments where historically there's been very little in terms of investment flowing, purely for development interventions. So from that perspective, these projects present a great opportunity to contribute to local economic development, to spur innovation. And I think also just dedicated revenues, community upliftment interventions over a decent period of time. But I think what we are not doing sufficiently is we're not taking advantage of this opportunity. And I think some of the cons that we've seen working on the ground are primarily around procedural fairness and justice. Brian spoke about it a bit earlier, just around how we engage with affected communities, because ultimately communities bear the brunt of a lot of these projects. And so in terms of how we bring them into conversations in a way that recognizes them as integral members of the value chain or participants in the value chain, that's quite important. And I think the other con is a lot of it. I'm not sure if it's not always intentional, but communities are often excluded in discussions where they need to be central to. And I think what this then translates to is a lot of the interventions that are currently happening are more sort of revolving doors, creating more dependencies in these communities. Because as Celiwe said earlier, we're not very intentional around community development and upliftment, and making these projects, making the value proposition of these projects very clear to communities. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for us to do development better, and particularly to engage differently with communities that are impacted and affected, but we're missing an opportunity, and that's largely due to sort of age-old ways of engaging that are not helping us move the needle in terms of engaging with communities and embedding some of those, insights into our interventions to ensure that, post project period, we're all comfortable to say that we've impacted a community positively and we've moved in a direction that wouldn't have been possible if a particular asset wasn't in a community. And so I think those are my sort of few words. There's a bit more, but I think those are my key takeaways on the projects and how, what are the impacts on local communities of renewable energy projects.
Thank you for that, Fezeka. Fulani, I'd like to bring you into the conversation, obviously drawing from your experience from having been an IPP and also having worked with international governments in terms of projects in the just energy transitions. I wanted to just bring you in terms of maybe we can further unpack on what we've started on the conversation and how can we do it better, or what role could organizations and governments play in really supporting communities through the just energy transitions, and what have been policies and initiatives that have been effective so far?
Thanks, Togo. I mean, I think one of the things that is important to avoid is an unnecessary battle of technologies. This sort of renewables versus, coal. It does not make sense for our economy. It doesn't make sense for a lot of developing economies. And I think certainly as people around the table today, ours is not, to sort of present a particular technology as the panacea, because none are, I think that's an important starting position. It's also important, or certainly I'd say from my positionality, it becomes very difficult to take accountability for decisions that were made by institutions and individuals that are not here. So in the context of today's conversation, I can appreciate that Brian's worked directly on the Komati project with affected communities, host communities of that asset. But there's no Eskom representative in this meeting. There is no representative of an international financier. The World Bank was mentioned. And so it becomes difficult for us to opine in a meaningful way on that. And also, I think the positive thing that we're seeing is the decoupling of the just energy transition from the decommissioning of coal-fired power plants, because there's a recognition that there's, one, a power crisis in South Africa, and two, an employment challenge in the country. And so as I understand it, Komati is going back to the market, actually. And so I think, the work of people like Brian has also been critical in surfacing, issues with the pace, and to Fezeka's point in terminology, the procedural issues that have worked against the ultimate intention that is behind the just energy transition. So I just wanted to talk to that, to say, it really, I don't think is worth our while to, enter this battle of technologies. The question for us as participants in the sector is, how do we craft it in a way that resolves current challenges and creates shared prosperity? And, when you look at the coal sector, its biggest advantage, despite, challenges raised by Muhammed, but its biggest advantage is its ability to, one, create jobs, and create, secondly, very deep value chain intersections. So, coal-fired power plant is linked to a mine, a refinery, etc. It becomes a far more complex operation that entails a lot more participation and involvement. Now, the challenge with the renewables sector, and you mentioned international players, is that it is really not intensive on all those fronts. So what the country has not done well is to industrialize the renewable energy sector, which we did with coal, meaning that key parts are not necessarily coming from South Africa. At a point in time, manufacturers were emerging, and, those manufacturers, because of policy uncertainty, divested from the country. And that would have been an opportunity for us to stabilize at least the employment creation side of the renewable energy sector. So I think when really thinking through how we, over time, get to a point where we have less dependency on international players, it has to do with the deepening of our capabilities along the entire value chain and industrializing in the sector in order to capture a lot more of the economics and, importantly, the jobs linked to the renewable energy sector. And so, for me, the point again is that renewables are not the panacea. There's a lot more that we ought to be doing to make the sector a compelling one for the country, but it doesn't answer all the country's energy questions. And my expectation of professionals such as ourselves is that we ought to be thinking in that productive and generative sense to say, what else can be done? How do we industrialize? How do we, what is the vision for communities that host these assets? And that for me is in a sense a more helpful conversation, and also speaks to us as practitioners who are working daily with communities that host energy assets. What next ought to be what we're solving for.
Thank you for that, Fulani. Celiwe, I'd like to bring you in, and especially with the work you've done in from a socioeconomic development perspective, and actually implementing these plans that are aimed at that are aimed at assisting local communities. Could you share with us, what's some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered in implementing these plans, as well as any ways or any mitigation strategies that can be considered then to actually ensure that in these projects, or in all the work that we're doing, we are adequately absorbing or working with local communities?
Thanks, Togo. I think just from the conversations today, the main or the core challenge is the same, and it's around engagement, right? Meaningful stakeholder engagement to better understand what the needs of the communities are. I think we found over time, if you go into a community or an area with a said budget, many times the people who come to the fore are the loudest or the most informed. And what then happens is that, the marginalized, or the ones with the lesser voice, don't necessarily get an opportunity to share what their challenges and needs are, which usually then formulates what the programming or the strategy would be from an SED perspective. So you'll find we get a lot of repeat programs. You'll always have a maths and science program. You'll always have sanitary towel programs, school uniform program, etc. Because those usually are the loudest voices. I think around the table and as professionals, we've got an opportunity to engage communities better, to understand what the needs are at a grassroots level. But it's also designing programs that are not to only address immediate needs, but more long-term strategic programs that speak to root cause, right? I think a lot of practitioners we struggle with the request, the desire from investors and boards for feel-good projects. Everybody wants to cut a ribbon. Everybody wants to see immediate impact on programs. But if we are to truly change the lives of communities, then we do need to do a little bit of root cause programming. So very grassroots, low impact, low visibility programs that we might only realize impact of in year 3 or 4 of implementation. There's also a big opportunity for collaboration, not only from a private sector and government perspective, but between technologies and industries. I think we see in many areas where we've got an IPP, we would have had a mine or any other bigger player in that space. Because the governing policies for those technologies differ so much, you find that collaboration becomes a bit harder. There is an opportunity for us to marry economic development, as we know it in IPP space, with the SLP programs of the mines, right? Where the mining space might have more budget for big infrastructure projects like building of schools and clinics. The IPP funding, which is not as big, could fund a more programmatic approach to implementation. So if the mine can fund a school, the IPP can fund the teachers or fund the program to ensure that the school produces the right level of learner, improving learner outcomes in that sense. Personally, as a practitioner, I think the most important thing to do when you implement socioeconomic development programs is to look at the economy beyond your own asset. If we plan programs to speak only to the IPP or the coal power stations, then we limit ourselves. I think Fulani touched on it now to say a big aspect of the success of coal was industrialization. While renewables might not be able to industrialize currently, for lack of a better word, but we still can use those funds to strengthen other economies that are at play in that area. So, we need to look at a meaningful way to uplift the economies of the communities that we are in, as opposed to trying to always link our programs directly to the asset or the funder of that program at that point in time. Thanks, Togo.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Celiwe. So we've heard a lot in terms of, when we're speaking about or we're looking at local communities, there's conversations around skills development, there's conversations around different plans, and you've all, from your different vantage points, have kind of seen how a lot of these initiatives, or what actually has then really been playing out in terms of local communities. And I want to just round off our conversation and really just getting from each of you, what in your view should be the long-term vision for local communities in the context of the just energy transitions, and taking it down to a practical, because I think very often when we speak about all these conversations around local communities, a lot of it seems very conceptual in, okay, we need to maybe create more jobs, or we need to have skills, or we need to, but what does that specifically look like? And what are the actual specific goals and targets that we should be aiming for, to achieve a sustainable and a just energy future? Brian, if I can start with you.
That's a very big question you're asking. I think for me, in terms of who we work with, so I primarily work with labor. So I look at it somewhat from that perspective, right? Over the last few years, we've been supporting to work on the South African renewable, in the context of this discussion, we're talking about industrialization, supporting to work on the South African renewable master plan, about how to gain better value from that process and from the development of this new industry. Almost all our comments are ignored. When we talk about why not consider what the potential is for public ownership, Eskom developing some of these plants, alternative configurations. So we're talking about who's responsible for socioeconomic development. Is it the multinationals, or should it be about reconceptualizing the role of local government in the context of the considerable challenges that we will face in terms of climate change, on top of historical inequalities, on top of a funding model for municipalities that is simply not delivering basic services? Yeah. So I think there are efforts that have been undertaken by quite significant stakeholders. Labor is a significant stakeholder. They are currently not being taken particularly seriously. Labor knows that it needs to build stronger relationships with communities to ensure that that ideas are constantly being ventilated and updated, but also that people are able to advocate for themselves what they need. So I'll give a simple example. We say wherever companies are receiving benefit, whether they be tax incentives, this is new through the new, let's say once the SARM is finalized, once it is agreed, and there's a social compact around our approach to that sector, where there are incentives that are being given to renewable energy projects, whether they are public or private, we should have provisions that explicitly articulate job training, the particular types of work that meet what we would consider decent work criteria, so qualitative and quantitative aspects of employment, so that we are really talking about who benefits in a more targeted way, not simply in a positivist way that renewable energy is good, creating more jobs is good, and let's see what happens. Currently, when we talk about the statistics or the impacts of some of these projects, the numbers are very opaque. Talk about full-time equivalent years. It's not very easy to understand what that means, and it is often sometimes misleading. And it makes it very difficult for us to actually have grounded conversations about what the impact of future projects might be if you're a regular person, like me too. When you say there'll be X amount of full-time equivalent jobs, what does that really mean? Yeah, I have been in an IPP, and I've also seen how some of those numbers can be reconfigured to mean a whole range of things. I don't think that necessarily the average South African thinks about the sum of green jobs may include the mending of a fence in a particular month. It may include that, the picking up of dead birds and bats at a wind turbine facility. Nothing wrong with that. But I don't think that that is necessarily what is when we're talking at a high level about some of these jobs and some of the opportunities, that might not be what we mean. When we're talking about industrialization and renewable energy jobs, that might not be what we mean. So what am I saying? I'm saying we need a different way to have this conversation that is more transparent, that some of the other stakeholders at the table need to deepen their engagement, and there is an acknowledgement of that. Labor's been involved in the process, but needs to engage deeply and more deeply with communities. I say more deeply with communities first, because I think that is going to be a fight. I think that the just energy transition is an outcome of a negotiation, and a negotiation to some extent is conflictual. There are different interests at play, and some of that needs to play out. We will get best value from the negotiation if there is, I think, better coordination between constituencies so that they can advocate adequately from their vantage point and from a position of strength. Because currently, communities and workers are negotiating from a position of weakness, which is why it's possible for you to walk into a community and conduct a poor public participation process. There's no consequences. Or why it's possible for the media to go into a hearing on Komati and not ask a difficult question about who's going to get the jobs or who benefits from this project, but simply to say a new agrivoltaics project will be developed at X date, and not even simply follow, or that there's a picture of a containerized microgrid at Komati, but which is the project that would have been the largest component of new employment on site, which does not exist today. That project has not come to fruition. The largest off-taker for that project, the off-taker for that project, I believe, was Eskom Distribution. I stand to be corrected on that, and would be happy to be corrected on that. So I've gone down a winding path, but all that to say, I think that we need to be centering the fact that people are actually stakeholders here. They don't simply need to be consulted, but they actually need to be negotiated with. And that the outcome of, at least for directly affected workers and communities, that maybe we should begin thinking about some of these processes as that we should honor a process of negotiation that precipitates collective bargaining agreements that people should be held accountable to, not just commitments. And we have to take seriously Muhammad's earlier opening point about you can't get around the fact that there needs to be reform in government and in local government. None of what I said is possible unless we're able to capacitate and resource local government, and without a capable state that is able to plan, convene appropriately, and executed stated plans as well. So yeah, I don't particularly feel very optimistic, but that's not really my place. Some of what I've shared is, I appreciate Fulani saying that some of what our work is doing is very important, but really also that the workers and the trade unionists are at the forefront of this and are also feeling, I think, more and more marginal to the climate conversation. 5 or 10 years ago, the conversation was there's going to be net jobs in Mpumalanga from renewables. Now the conversation is maybe we can't simply talk about renewables being the panacea, which I think is absolutely correct. But there is a change in the tone of the conversation. And I hope that we can bring some of the people working on this more to the forefront of the discussion, and again, take what they say seriously, engage with their ideas, and not simply tick it off.
Thank you for that, Brian. Fezeka, if I could bring you back into the conversation just in terms of sharing what your long-term view or vision is for local communities. But I think, in thinking or looking at unpacking specific goals, if you could maybe just emphasize on how do we actually then operationalize or getting to a place where we are genuinely uplifting these local communities.
Thanks, Togo. I think there are a lot of loud voices, particularly around sort of the community discussion, and it's not necessarily always the loud voices with the correct messaging. So I think my primary suggestion is sort of operationalization of how do we include communities is to improve how we engage with community stakeholder groups. And when I say this, I mean to move away from tick box community needs analysis approaches, tick box exercise, you're in and you're out, but really to look at ways that are useful in surfacing local knowledge in a way that drives, development interventions in this just energy transition discussion. But it's really to go down to a grassroots level and to start building agency in communities and to encourage individuals in communities to speak, and to create opportunities for community members to speak for themselves. I think there's also been an over-reliance on, structured ways of communicating at a community level, and these haven't always been effective. So I think the starting point is to improve how we engage with local communities, and create platforms and channels to support engagement with communities on a continual basis, not as and when we need them or as and when it's convenient for us to do so, because ultimately that the continuous conversation and those discussions are where a lot of ideas around development at a community level, that's where the conversation, those conversations are where ideas emerge. So it's improving how we engage with communities. And I think secondly, it's to critically look at the processes around development, to ensure that, the strategic intent of the just energy transition and the procedural elements align. What we're finding on the ground is that we've got social justice goals and objectives, but if we critically look at, the processes of accessing support at a community level, these are not always supportive of just energy transition goals at a community level. It's an example would be to go into an area and demand that an SMME to get access to any kind of training needs 3 years of financial statements, in an environment where, that is out of context. So it's really looking at our processes and how we make support available to local communities. And I think the final one is around capacity building. This conversation is very broad, the conversation around capacity building. And it's to also be honest and realistic about what is possible from a capacity and a capacity building perspective at a community level, bearing in mind, what the status of the quality of education is in the country and how possible or how realistic it is to say, that at some point in time, we'd be employing from the local community, or we'll have a subcontractor with highly technical skills to provide services on site. So it's again looking at, capacity building interventions that are context specific, and to Fulani and Celiwe's point, that not only are myopic in their approaches, right? So focusing specifically on the renewable energy industry, but looking at other industries and partnerships across other industries where the skills that are currently available in those communities could be, with some support, be of better use. So I think those are my sort of 3 takeaways around improving ways of engaging, and, critical review of how we do things, our processes, and whether those are conducive to the outcomes that we want and our objectives, and designing capacity building interventions that are contextually appropriate and take into cognizant the realities of the communities on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Fezeka. Celiwe, if I could bring you back in and just, sharing what your long-term vision is for local communities, and also then while speaking around goals, and some of the comments that you've made today have really been tied to what programs are actually being done in communities, and how in some instances these programs actually aren't appropriate anymore, or there's really no focus or proper investigation that's then undertaken to ensuring that we actually get the appropriate programs in place. So in sharing your vision, if you could also then maybe share some what in your view would be specific programs that are most critical in really driving or ensuring that we aren't leaving anyone behind in this transition.
Thanks, Togo. I think the big vision is truly to drive or increase employment, right, at various levels in the community. I think with many of the conversations, we're either trying to save a job or create a job. The most impactful programs in the communities would truly be programs that increase or drive growth in the informal sector. We've become, truly consumed by trying to create programs that sound right, or that are sexy and big, and speak to our objectives as people who come from more urbanized or communities with better access. One of the biggest challenges in the communities that we work in is access and accessibility. I mean, if you look at a community like Pof Adder as an example, if I come with an urbanized view of what programming look like there, I'll design, this really massive program, agriculture program where they'll transport their chicken, their chickens to Cape Town. But it's not practical, just given where those communities are placed. So we need to be intentional. We need to be comfortable with creating programs that might not be as big or as sexy as we want them to be. One of the programs that I've seen being implemented in rural communities, or remote communities rather, is called a street entrepreneurship program, where you drive entrepreneurship by supporting informal traders or unregistered traders in those communities, as opposed to going into a community like Onsiapkans and looking for a alien vegetation clearing company. You're not going to find one. They're probably only learning the concepts now. So it's being comfortable with supporting the smaller businesses that might not give you the recognition or as much of a recognition as you think you might get from that. The other one, Togo, is creating access, right? So a lot of these communities don't have access to the internet, to information, to better schooling, to quality learning, to quality healthcare, and so many other things. So at the core of socioeconomic development programs within the transition is truly creating access at various levels for the community members, to ensure that they are healthy enough or informed enough to make the right decision, whether the decision is to stay within the community or to exit the community. But it truly should be one that is informed and that has sufficient resources to do as such. And then finally, I think from my side, it's beyond trying to match one for one. We also need to look at opportunities for regeneration. A lot of these communities that we go in now were, either former railway towns or mining towns, etc. How do we regenerate those communities given what is there already? How do we repurpose some of those spaces? How do we repurpose those assets in collaboration with private sector players and government to ensure that the resources that are there can be better utilized for the upliftment of communities? I mean, we might look at, there's certain programs we look at now and we think they are not necessarily the right fit. So the one that they like to make an example around is school shoes and play areas, right? When we look at it at face value, we think those programs are not a necessity for schools. But when you look at what an urban area school has and what a remote area school has, that play area, that uniform is important. Some programs will be about restoring dignity and pride into those communities so that there's a better sense of ownership in driving the conversations and driving the solution for their future. So it's a combination of strategic long-term programs and also programs that look at restoring dignity in those communities to enable and empower those communities to drive the conversations around what future programming would look like for them. It might not be instant, we don't expect to see results tomorrow, but it's also having the patience and consistency to drive those programs to ensure that we see results in the long run. Thanks, Togo.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Celiwe. Fulani, if I could ask you to please share what your long-term vision is for local communities are in the context of the just energy transition, and maybe you can also just share in terms of any best practices or that you've come across and that then kind of inform or speak to specific goals or programs then that can really be used to successfully navigate the just energy transition in a way that benefits local communities.
Sure. Thanks, Togo. I think the starting point for us as an organization is to appreciate our role as advocates for change. There's what we can do as Billy, in the communities that host our assets, but the broader conversation has to do with trends that we've observed and the bigger change that we'd like to be a part of and cannot drive independently. And I make that point to say, one of the first papers that we published as an organization was titled Lost in Procurement. And it addressed a host of issues that we recognized about the renewable energy sector, which we were participants in, but also appreciating the limitations of, so the issues of definitions. We've spoken, quite loosely and of course, because of a limited amount of time, about the concept of community. We're all a part of a community. Some are physical and others not. But when all of these things are converted into measurable items, it becomes evident that there are challenges in the sector, at least in the renewable energy sector, and as per the state's definition. When we speak of a community, we're talking about communities that fall within a 50-kilometer radius of a power plant. Now, that may not always cohere with people's own sense of community and who is in and who is out, right? And so there are issues of definition, there are issues of, who gets counted or what gets counted. Brian spoke about, what is a job year versus a job as it is understood by all of us, actually. There's a lot that exists in the technical space around what gets counted and how those definitions are determined that doesn't necessarily agree with I'd say, a common sense understanding of these issues. And so what that has meant for Billy is that whilst on the one hand we can appreciate the problem, I think it also indicated to us the importance of appreciating that the longer term change is driven through advocacy, and the shorter term change really requires our direct involvement. And when I say our direct involvement, how we express our vision for and with communities, it is something that is also driven by personal experiences. So I was born in a township and spent my entire life having to leave the township to access opportunity. My parents, that was the standard ritual. We all wake up in the morning and we leave where we are from. And that communicates a lot to you as a person about your value, because it means that your community is not capable or worthy of giving you a complete life. You can't live and work and play in the same space. And so in our work at Billy, our vision and what we're seeking to restore is a sense of community as a complete socioeconomic system in which people can live and work. And what that looks like is that we are focused on creating jobs, and we can do that outside of the prescripts or the sort of limitations of big state procurement program, or even the limitations of a private off-taker. We are playing a direct investment role in creating new industries in the communities that we operate in. We are, creating new infrastructure, modernizing infrastructure, and how we do that is not all driven by what exists within the budgetary constraints of an IPP project that we may own. A big, I spoke earlier on about my role as being focused on impact investments, but it is about finding capital elsewhere to do what needs to be done in a community context, because our projects, I want to say they don't generate enough revenue, but let me say they're structured in a way that doesn't necessarily result in a lot of revenue being driven back into communities. And so it's our responsibility to find capital elsewhere, and that's a big part of what we do. And what that also looks like in the short term, which I think is my call to action, is that someone has to pay the price for this. And as professionals, as young people in South Africa who've had the privilege of access and education, in part it's our responsibility to work harder to pay an additional price so that we can lift the rest of our country. You know, I think there's no avoiding that. That part of our responsibility is to do more, to take losses in whatever format that they may appear. It's not hard to start a business. You know, Fezeka spoke about herself as having started a consultancy in the sector. None of this is easy, but someone needs to pay the price. And we pay that price because we appreciate that we are inordinately privileged and have participated in the dividend of justice in this country in a way that others have not. And if we want to live in a country that is just and fair and prosperous, and one that really enables all its citizens to express themselves, we need to do more because we've received more. And that for me is the ultimate call to action. The justice in the transition is in our bodies, and in recognizing that for the justice that we've received as a consequence of South Africa's transition, we are also required to do more.
Thank you very much for that, Fulani. Muhammed, if I could get your views in terms of what is your vision, your long-term vision for local communities in the context of the just energy transition, and really what are your specific goals or programs that or specific support that should be put in place to assist communities to actually achieve a just transition?
Thank you, Thokozile. I just want to mention that there's been some good work done by Dr. Tumi Malope at the University of Stellenbosch, who looked at what has been discussed by particularly Fezeka, that we shouldn't look at coal communities only. We need to look at host communities that host renewables in the Northern Cape. Tumi calls this the flip side of the just transition. So he says that the most effective way of looking at this, based on his fieldwork in Lourisfontein, is direct cash transfers to the communities. I think our conversation ultimately reflects the sad state of inequality in this country. And I think this has been touched on by Fulani and Celiwe. We're all guilty of being privileged by this transition, but also forming part of this rent-seeking class of this just transition. And I think that we've all fallen into the trap of more money being spent on studies and conferences in Cape Town, and over-analyzing and over-intellectualizing this transition than actual projects on the ground that actually impact people in a meaningful way. At some point, communities are tired of talking and going through processes and negotiations and consultations, and they just want to see progress being made and conversations being held. And I think that ties back into what Dr. Tumi Malope studied. And the easiest way is that we can't sit here and think that there's a place of saviorism from any one person or group. It's a collective effort, and ultimately communities on the ground know what's best for them. We can't sit in our little bubbles and think of some harebrained schemes that we should implement everywhere. So ultimately, that's more or less of what I'm trying to say. Communities need to be empowered by themselves, and ultimately that comes from the dividends and the benefits that they gain from being in those host communities and being part of those core communities and doing what they know best, not us sitting in our little urban bubbles, as Celiwe said, coming from a particular social class and being very far removed from the realities of the people on the ground. So ultimately, that's my vision for the future, communities being empowered. And just to end off on a statistic from SALDRU at UCT, the Labour Research Development Institute, they said that the top 10% of incomes in South Africa, if you earn above this, you're in the top 10% of incomes. It's 7,300 rands. So if I can go out on a limb and say that most of us here, sitting here with massive salaries, think that we can be prescriptive on what communities on the ground need to do, we're too far removed from that reality to do so, and we're part of the problem if we're quite honest about it. Thank you, Thokozile.
Thank you for that, Muhammed. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Energy Conversations podcast. I want to extend my sincere gratitude to our guests for sharing their invaluable insights and experience. Today, we continued with the journey to demystify South Africa's energy landscape and empower ordinary South African citizens. Join us next time as we continue with our exploration. Until then, remember that the power to change our energy future lies within each of us. Thank you for tuning in, and let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe and let's shape South Africa's energy future together.